So today I'm really delighted to welcome to the Women's Room Legal Division podcast, Tessa Khan, who is the founder and chief executive of Uplift UK, and who today I think would describe herself as an international climate change lawyer and campaigner. And I thought it would just be really fascinating to talk to Tessa because she is an amazing example of someone who started life as a lawyer, as a solicitor working in a big commercial firm, and who during the course of her career has really found her passion and purpose and has pursued them, so that today, although still operating in the legal space, she's also working proactively on the front line to support major change in our society today. So Tessa, welcome. Lovely to have you here. Before we talk about the journey you've been on, how you started in law, how you ended up at Uplift or creating Uplift, could you just tell us a little bit, just a few lines about Uplift and what Uplift does?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me on your podcast, Erica. Really delighted to be here. So in short, Uplift is a research and campaigning organisation that is supporting a transition away from oil and gas production in the UK, given the role that oil and gas play in driving the climate crisis.
Amazing. And how long have you been going? How long ago did you start it up?
So I started Uplift at the start of 2021.
Okay.
For about 3.5 years.
Okay,
and
amazing.
Yeah, we've grown pretty rapidly in that time.
Okay, cool. Well, look, we'll come back to it let's go back to right to the beginning, and then we'll come back to Uplift as the end of, well, not the end of your journey, but the current position of where you are now. But yeah, tell me a little bit about getting into law. Did you know you wanted to be a lawyer at school? Where did you grow up? How did you decide to become a solicitor initially?
So I think my path to law really started with high school debating, I would say. So I grew up in Perth in Western Australia. Mm-hmm. And I was lucky that with the encouragement of initially my parents, who encouraged me to kind of engage in public speaking competitions and that kind of thing when I was a bit younger, I would say in primary school, because my dad was on his school debating team. But anyway, by the time I got to high school, I had some teachers who encouraged me to try out for the state debating team. So in Australia, there's a sort of national competition. Students from each state sort of participate in that competition. And our school, which was a state school, and in Australia, the high school sort of debating scene is very dominated by private schools. But our school happened to host a debate when the national competition was hosted in Perth, and I sort of watched these kids and I thought they were amazing. And I definitely thought it was well beyond anything I could do. But my English literature teacher at the time was like, why don't you just throw your hat in the ring and just show up to the auditions or the tryouts and see how you go. And so anyway, I was lucky enough to get onto both the state team and in the subsequent year, the Australian schools debating team. Having joined that, we had an amazing coach, a woman called Andrea Coomber, who is now the CEO of the Howard League for Penal Reform in the UK, formerly of Justice. And she brought the team to India, where she was living at the time, to coach us for a couple of weeks before we went to the World Championships.
Wow.
And anyway, I mean, the sort of summary of that story is that Andrea was working as a human rights lawyer at the time. And she was working for an Indian human rights NGO. And it was the first time that I had ever met anyone who worked as a human rights lawyer, who was sort of using the law for good, I suppose, in a sort of social sense. And I, my parents are immigrants, and my dad was an academic in computer science, and I didn't have anyone in my social network or my family network who was a lawyer. And so all I knew about it was really sort of what you saw on TV. And so I just had no idea really that you could use the law to engage in sort of social change. And so that was the inspiration really for me to become a lawyer. Of course, once you also, certainly in Australia, the high school debating scene is dominated by people who end up being lawyers, and the competition is sponsored by law firms, and suddenly you have all this exposure. And anyway, so that sort of made it seem inevitable in a way that was the path that I'd go down.
How did you get on in the World Championship? I didn't even know there was a World Championships of Debating. How did you get on?
It is fiercely competitive. We won, actually.
Wow, you won. Well, all thanks to Andrea's amazing. I can't believe she took you to India to coach you. I mean, how incredible. And you won. That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing was definitely life-changing in a number of different ways. But yes, we weren't the first winning team that Andrea's coached. Absolutely.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Interesting. Maybe there's a whole new career for her. I mean, it's interesting about debating because I think it's one of the things that probably debating and public speaking is one of the things we get exposed to less in education in the UK. I think in America, they're much better at it. And you can see that when you see, you come across Americans working in the corporate world. So and public speaking is one of the things I get asked about a lot, people struggling or feeling very nervous about public speaking. So maybe, doing more of it when you're younger. There is an amazing organization here called Toastmasters for anyone who's listening. I'd really recommend joining. There's loads of them all around the country that you can join and you can practice public speaking with them and in a way that doesn't feel daunting. So if you're interested in that, and if you haven't yet won the World Championships of Debating, then try Toastmasters. Okay, so then you were like law, but did you know then? Because I guess also seeing Andrea at the coalface of doing human rights related law in India, you actually saw what it looked like in practice. Did you know that was the area you wanted to go into initially, or were you just like, no, actually law looks good?
No, I mean, I was always interested in, broadly speaking, social justice and human rights. And that has a lot to do with the fact that my family is from Bangladesh and, we spent a lot of time in Bangladesh while I was growing up. We'd spend summer holidays there, for example. And, especially as a kid, I think you're so sensitive to the massive inequalities that just looking at the way that people live and not really understanding why it is that, you despite sharing everything in common with my family in Bangladesh, like I happen to have a completely different lifestyle and quality of life and prospects. And it just didn't make any sense. It seemed incredibly unfair that just by virtue of, good luck on the part of my parents, I mean, they worked very hard, but there was no reason why my cousins were any less deserving of the opportunities that I have. And so I guess I was very sensitive to that sort of injustice and inequality from a pretty young age. And so I knew that was what I wanted to ultimately work towards, although obviously as a kid you don't really have any idea what that looks like in practice and what careers might offer you the opportunity to do that. But then, meeting Andrea and seeing that human rights law was something that allowed you to engage with those sorts of questions every day and really help to make people's lives better, people who are really vulnerable, and resolve that sort of injustice seems like the path that I wanted to go down.
Sure. And is that that's not where you started out though, is it? You started in a commercial law firm, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And that's partly because in Perth, the opportunities for public interest lawyering were pretty limited. And also with the encouragement of people like Andrea, who also started her career at a commercial law firm in Australia, everybody sort of said to me that regardless of what you do in the sort of medium to long term, going into a big firm is a great place to get training and to sort of understand the nuts and bolts of legal practice.
Yeah.
And I also saw it as an opportunity to earn some money, given that I knew that I was then planning to leave. I always had a plan to leave after a couple of years and just see what else I could move into. So, I don't regret that at all. It was, it was a great kind of training ground.
And then how did you make the move? What was the next move?
So then I had to do a master's in the UK.
Ah, okay.
And so that was also the opportunity to specialise a bit more, just because my kind of undergraduate, my bachelor's was pretty general, and I assumed that if I wanted to work internationally in human rights, I would need a bit more of just academic specialisation. So, that was the
Okay, brilliant. So it was like using further education to signal a way that you wanted your career to go, I guess. And then how easy was it to then get a job after that?
Yeah, so I did the BCL at Oxford, and obviously, you know, there are kind of amazing networks and opportunities that you get exposed to in the course of that. And I studied a number of the kind of human rights and public law courses as part of that degree. And I then got a position, it was initially an internship at the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, which, yeah, while not strictly speaking human rights law, I mean, it's international humanitarian law and criminal law, all the things that I was interested in.
Yeah.
And then I sort of got a full-time consultancy position there after my internship was up. And it was interesting because I think if you had told my sort of 21-year-old self that I would get to work in the office of the prosecutor for a war crimes tribunal, you know, in The Hague,
Really? Yeah.
the dream come true.
Yeah.
But I have huge amounts of respect. I work with like unbelievably bright and committed people. But I think I was a bit troubled maybe by the sort of politics of the institution. It sort of seemed like, and I don't think this is a controversial thing to say, but, you know, it was ultimately an effort to create accountability for a conflict that the West had failed to prevent in the first place, or to sort of mobilise the resource to do something about. And, you know, and I think I felt like I wanted to be involved in efforts to stop these conflicts from happening to start with.
Right.
And that the roots of these conflicts often are about inequality, whether that's social or economic inequality and human rights inequalities. And so I moved on from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia to working in Washington, D.C. for the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative, which is basically, the American Bar Association is their big sort of legal professional association. And they have a wing, the Rule of Law Initiative, that supports lawyers to work to advance human rights and development efforts in other countries.
Right.
And so it was really through that I spent a number of years doing that work and started to really understand the root causes of conflict, which, yeah, as I said, I think are often down to social and economic inequality. And that was also when I first started to encounter and just grapple with the role that climate change is also playing in driving those inequalities and also actually conflict as well.
Yeah. And how easy was it? Because I know a lot of younger lawyers are really keen to get into human rights. You know, that's where what's hard is what advice do you give people about how to get into it? Was it easy to then get that role? I guess you were in The Hague. That looks amazing on your CV. Was it easy to then get the role in DC?
I applied for a bunch of jobs and that was the one that I got. So I'm not sure that, I didn't really know much about the organisation actually when I was applying for it. So no, I think especially at our kind of entry level, it is very competitive. Mm-hmm. And I did definitely take a risk in saying yes to that role, not really knowing what I was getting myself into. But I think that's part of just what you have to be prepared to do. If, you know, provided they're offering a decent salary, I think the world of human rights is so massive and so diverse. Like you just have a chance often if you can't get a role with a very well-known organisation like a Human Rights Watch or an Amnesty International. You know, I think you've just got to go with what's available.
Yeah. And did it satisfy your desire? Like, because it's interesting, like learning about the rule of law and how it's being developed in other countries. Did that satisfy your desire to be more at the beginning of how can we stop these bad things happening? Did it sort of?
Yeah, definitely. It gave me a much better sort of political and social and structural understanding of, you know, of what drives inequality. I think, though, what I found quite unsatisfying about that job was doing it from behind a desk in Washington, D.C. And working, you know, in places all over the world, but, you know, in the global south. and trying to kind of bring my analysis and my tools to bear on a situation that, I really didn't actually know as well as I should have, because I was living in DC. And so, so then the sort of next move that I made was to northern Thailand, to work for a regional women's rights network called the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. And so that's basically a network of everything from very grassroots to national feminist or women's rights organisations working to advance women's rights at the national and regional level across Asia and the Pacific. And that was much more meaningful in a way, because I was working every day with colleagues who, in countries where these inequalities were being experienced, and just feeling much like I had a lot more legitimacy in my involvement in those issues, but also working much more closely than I ever could with the people who are really at the front lines of those fights.
Yeah. So what were you actually doing on a day-to-day basis? Can you give us an example of like types of things that you were doing?
Yeah, sure. So one thing that that I was responsible for was supporting the engagement of these women's rights organisations with UN processes that ultimately create accountability for national governments for their human rights obligations. So there was a process in the UN in 2015 around the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, which are a sort of framework that all countries have sort of signed up to address big development challenges. And we were really concerned to make sure that women's rights and women's perspectives were really, and gender equality was really integrated into the way that those goals were shaped, so that women don't get left behind, as they so often do. And so, we would bring our partners from around the region to New York to engage in the negotiations, to speak directly with their government representatives, to help shape the language that was in those commitments, which then helped them to hold their, aside from the fact that, I think especially it's difficult to get access to your government representatives in the best of times, but in a developing country where there's even more distance often between ordinary citizens and their representatives, being somewhere like the UN where you can just walk up to your government delegation and have a conversation with them is powerful. So, and then of course those organisations will go back to their own countries with a much better understanding of what their governments have signed up to, therefore what they can demand that they are accountable for in their own countries, in their own courts, or through the UN human rights mechanisms in Geneva or elsewhere. And so we would also support them to, for example, write complaints to these international human rights mechanisms to say that their governments aren't abiding by the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, for example, or the other international human rights instruments that are meant to protect women's rights.
Amazing. And then from there, so what was the transition into a specific focus on more environmental and climate related issues?
Yeah, it was two things really. The first is, as I mentioned, my family's in Bangladesh. That is a country, it's one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change. And so I have always been conscious of how present and serious a threat that is to people who live there, both in terms of, climate change intensifies the frequency and the severity of natural disasters like typhoons or cyclones that Bangladesh is often hit by. And then there's also sea level rise. So, it's a very low-lying country and climate change is driving an increase in our sea levels. So there's just much more regular kind of flooding and encroachment of salt water in drinking water supplies and that kind of thing. So there's that, I guess, quite personal connection and awareness. And then also the women that I worked with all over Asia and certainly the Pacific, which is also very vulnerable to climate change, there's all of this data that confirms that women are actually the ones who are hit hardest by climate change for a whole host of reasons, starting from the fact that women are less likely to survive natural disasters because they are physically less well equipped and skilled to survive in a disaster, like just something like knowing how to swim, for example. Certainly in countries in Asia and the Pacific, women tend not to have those survival skills, all the way through to the fact that when water becomes more scarce, when food becomes more scarce, when people lose their jobs because, agriculture is a huge source of livelihood for women, and, when there are droughts or floods, those kinds of livelihoods are hardest hit, and women end up bearing the burden of increased childcare, increased all kinds of, domestic obligations like collecting water, getting food. All of that falls on women, and all of those things become harder in a world in a changing climate.
Yeah,
basically. And women have less security because they don't have property rights. So if they lose their ability to farm or, to engage in those sorts of livelihoods, they've got less collateral or less of a backup. It's very well evidenced, and, all of the UN agencies have written extensively about the fact that women are really the ones that are likely to be hardest hit by climate change. And I was hearing that from the women that we were working with as well.
Yeah, it is interesting because obviously we hear a lot about climate change and I guess the impact on daily life, but that link into human rights and women in particular, I think we're starting to hear more of that from people, but it's not like, I wouldn't say it's in the daily dialogue of people. So it's great to hear you sort of giving light to this. It's not just a climate issue, it's a climate and human rights issue as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it really threatens to undo so much of the progress on development and just towards social and economic equality for women across the world, really. So I basically just came to the view that, if I was serious about working on human rights, then climate change is the biggest systemic threat to our human rights globally. And so that was pretty much the beginning of a decision to focus more or less exclusively on that, but always from a human rights perspective.
Sure. So you're in Thailand, in Chiang Mai, I think, in the north of Thailand.
Yes, that's right.
So how did you get from Chiang Mai to the UK and setting up Uplift?
So there are a couple of steps in between those two things. So first of all, in 2015, I think was starting to feel a bit demoralised by the speed at which governments were, at the international level at least, moving to address climate change. So the Paris Agreement on climate change is the big sort of international treaty that was adopted. And it's useful in a number of ways, but what it stops short of is creating accountability for how the steps that governments take to address climate change at the national level. There is no sanction for not doing what you've promised to do, which is to keep climate change to a safe level of 1.5 degrees of warming compared to sort of pre-industrial level. That's the goal. It's in the Paris Agreement, but there's no sanction if you don't contribute to reach the goal. And that's the limit of international law often, right, is that there just aren't the kind of accountability mechanisms at the national level. But I heard about in mid-2015, I wrote a piece an opinion piece in The Guardian about why I thought actually under human rights law, governments, there should be national and level and hard accountability for a failure to act on climate change because human rights law provides a hard legal framework. And I was contacted by some lawyers in the Netherlands who were at the time responsible for a case against the Dutch government in which they argued on the basis of human rights law as well as tort law and a few other laws under the Dutch framework that the Dutch government was acting unlawfully, not cutting the Netherlands' greenhouse gas emissions faster. And they were trying to use a national court to enforce that accountability. And I, replied and I thought it was super interesting and I wished them luck and I assumed that I'd never hear from them again or never hear about it again because what they were trying to do was unprecedented. But then they won that case and it was huge news. It was, covered by the BBC and New York Times and the Washington Post and everyone was talking about it. And it did seem like a pretty important breakthrough in that there was now a national court saying to a government, you've got to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a certain percentage by 2020. because of the human rights harms, basically, that climate change will cause, including in the Netherlands. And yeah, I just thought that that was such a powerful new way of compelling government action on climate change. So I basically got back in touch with these Dutch lawyers and I said to them, you know, I would be happy to quit my job to work with you to both defend your case against the inevitable appeal that the Dutch government's going to file, but also to help you work with lawyers and campaigners in other countries to help them do what you've done, but in their own jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm.
And so we set up something called the Climate Litigation Network. And that's pretty much what we went on to do over the next 5 years, is just support lawyers and activists in other countries who also wanted to file cases in their national courts, arguing that their government's failure to take climate change seriously was unlawful. And we supported a case that won in the Supreme Court of Ireland. We won in the Netherlands in the Supreme Court ultimately as well. We supported a case in South Korea that was just in the last couple of weeks also successful in their constitutional court. And in the last 6 years, I mean, climate litigation has exploded as a field, not just because of our efforts, but lots of different organisations and individuals who are looking to use national laws to create more incentives and accountability for governments to take climate change seriously.
And can I ask, because obviously you said like, I'm willing to give up my job and come and help you. Was that a scary decision? Was that like difficult to make? What was that like?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, they were very happy for me to do that, but it was on the proviso that they didn't have any money.
Yeah.
So it came, you know, and I said to them, it's fine, you know, we're trying to create an organisation. Someone's got to fundraise for that, and that includes for my position. So I'm happy to take that responsibility on. And until I can do that, I'll work as a consultant, you know, just do stuff in my spare time to earn money. So I took on the risk, which I just was prepared to do, I think. It's actually what we were trying to do. And it felt to me like a pretty persuasive proposition for a funder. I underestimated at the time how challenging fundraising can be, but, you know, the Climate Litigation Network as an organisation now is double the size that it was when I left in, 2021, and is thriving. And, so I think ultimately that was a well-calculated risk.
Amazing. So, but I'm really interested in, because obviously there are lots of people who, if you ask them, are you happy with what you're doing? Would you like to do something else? There are lots of people who have a passion or something in the future they'd love to do, but a lot of people are held back due to risk aversion or fear of giving up their job. So how was it? Did you work through a process? Like, how did you how were you comfortable? Did you have coaching? What was it that enabled you to make that decision? Did you do pro and con lists? Like, was there anything, or were you just like, I'm doing this, I don't care,
Yeah, it wasn't quite that impulsive. I think I definitely did have a pro and con list, but I think I was able to isolate the risk to being purely financial.
Mm-hmm.
And I, at the time I was, in my early 30s, I didn't have kids. I felt pretty lucky to be in a position where I could take a risk.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I had savings, but I also knew that I think I gave myself a timeline, of maybe a year or 18 months to see how it would go and to then reassess, if it just looked like a totally hopeless proposition that no one was interested in funding and we weren't getting traction in terms of our actual objectives.
Yeah.
I had confidence that I'd be able to find work.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah. And it may not be the job that I, would want, but I never thought I'd be out on the street. I guess that was kind of the threshold that I was working towards. It's like, well, I'm taking a risk to do something I believe in. And I'm incredibly motivated by it because it is entirely values driven for me. It really is something that I believe could make a difference to an issue that I care extremely deeply about. And I'm pretty sure I'm not going to end up on the street if it goes wrong.
Yeah.
So, but I will have, I will have at least tried.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because that idea of giving yourself a time limit is I've heard that from other female entrepreneurs as well, that they're like, look, I'm going to try this out. I'll give myself a year or so. And if it doesn't work, but I think the difference is it's this confidence around, look, I'll be able to get some sort of job. Whereas I think a lot of people are like, I'm on this career trajectory. If I step off, it's like they feel like they're stepping into a black hole. And that, so if you might lose a few years or you might end up going in a slightly different direction, it's that like coming off this ordered path, I guess, that a lot of people find very hard. Yeah.
Yeah. And I definitely understand that. And I think it's, it's probably different for different fields of law and the extent to which you do want to get on a particularly hierarchical kind of well-defined path.
Yeah.
But I also think that if you have something that you're really passionate about, there's a cost to you not pursuing that as well. And also I think generally, and certainly someone who now is responsible for recruiting, and I've recruited loads of people in the last 10 years, I look very favourably upon people taking risks. And even if it doesn't work out, I think that that's good for your CV.
Yeah.
It sort of shows that you do back yourself, and whether you succeed or fail is down to a gazillion external factors.
Yeah.
And so I think it's still, it's worth really thinking about. And if giving yourself a timeline like a year or 18 months helps, I mean, I think in a way that's slightly misleading because by the time you get to 12 months or 18 months, you're often pretty invested in something. You may give yourself another 12 months or 18 months, but if that's what it takes to feel safe and to provide safety, then that's a good device, I think.
Yeah, amazing. And have you ever had coaching when you're going through any of these careers?
Yes. So I started coaching just before I set up Uplift.
Okay.
I basically, I think with the Climate Litigation Network, it took a few years. Like I always believed in the work, and I think the work started paying off very soon. The idea of it, the sort of networks we were building, the impact we were having, the sort of security from funding and everything else took a little while longer. But by 2020, it felt very solid as an organisation and the work that we were doing. And I felt confident that the value that I was bringing to the organisation was no longer as clear as when I started it, because I had brilliant colleagues who had, great strategic instincts, and the organisation itself was just kind of up and running and ticking along. And so I felt ready to do the next thing. And this felt like more of a risk, partly because, when I set up the Climate Litigation Network, I did it with a co-founder, my Dutch colleague at the time. And there's some sort of safety in that, I suppose.
Yeah.
But in setting up Uplift, which was, born as both the fact that I was, by that point, living in the UK, and I was very interested in going back to combining legal advocacy with other kinds of advocacy. I really believe that the scale of political change that we need and economic and industrial change that we need to address the climate crisis, you're not going to achieve that through courts alone. Courts aren't set up to come up with complex policy solutions. You need to engage in political advocacy. You need to change the way the media talks about these issues. You need to change people's minds. And so I was interested in working with all of those tools. And I thought that in the UK, it was very interesting that as a country, the UK has in many ways shown a lot of leadership on climate change as an issue, but we still have a very large domestic oil and gas industry. We extract 1 million barrels of oil and gas a day from the North Sea. And we're at a point where the science is clear that you can't open any new oil and gas fields. We can't add any more oil and gas to existing reserves if we're going to stay within safe climate limits. And so the UK's actions are totally at odds with what's required in that regard. So anyway, I was like, I would like to work on that problem. And I'd like to do it with all of those tools. And so that's what I was sort of thinking. And, ultimately that's what Uplift does. But starting as another organisation and doing it on my own felt like, again, a big risk because Finland was a very comfortable place to be at that point. We were celebrated for the work that we were doing, and it was all going really well. And I started working with a coach, and that was partly to really think through, whether or not that was something I could do, and if I did it, like how I needed, mostly just to equip myself to get comfortable with the huge amount of uncertainty that would bring.
Yeah, okay. Because I presume the coach, I mean, I always say to people who ask about coaching, it's not about the coach, and they're not acting as a mentor or advisor. It's really about you hearing yourself talk out loud and talk through these issues. So that was what you needed, was it? You needed to have someone who could reflect back, support and challenge. I presume they weren't mentoring you through it. It was you sort of needing to, almost have a twin so you could hear yourself and work through it. Is that what you were doing in the coaching?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I was also just working through all of the different kind of aspects of setting it up with them.
Okay.
And I think it was really helpful because, my own biases towards not seeing my strengths or underestimating or overstating risks, all of that. It's very helpful to have someone who also knows what you've done in the past.
Right.
To help remind you what you're actually capable of.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay. So then you got comfortable with the idea of setting up Uplift. And then I guess then you had to go out and get funding, did you? Was that the first thing you had to do?
Yeah. Well, so I was very lucky. I won an award just before I set up Uplift. That was it's called the Climate Breakthrough Award. Basically, is an award for people who run this award give you $2 million US.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Yeah. So, and the idea is that you can do whatever you want with that money as long as it's about addressing climate change.
Yeah. Okay. So look, there was still a bit of work the coach needed to do, because you just said, I was really lucky that I won this award. Really, you weren't lucky. I mean, obviously it was very fortuitous that you won an award that had money attached, but it wasn't luck, was it? It was all about your strengths and your achievements. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that award made a huge difference, I think, to my own self-belief. It shouldn't take a $2 million award to do that, but, it obviously helps to have that validation. But I'd already been working with the coach at that point, because I was also just working through the challenges of leaving my own organisation and having the confidence to do that and not feel guilty about doing that, because I wanted to move on to the next thing. And, everything else, and just to have the confidence in that process. Yeah, so I had some funding, but I didn't have enough funding. Certainly now that we're in year 4, I mean, I kind of worked my way through that funding pretty quickly. So I did need to, from day one, go out and continue to fundraise. Yeah.
And I guess you're already a pretty public-facing role, but now, even more, like you're at the advocacy, so dealing with the media, dealing with senior politicians. Like, how have you found that, both in terms of confidence and in terms of being a woman? How's that been?
Yeah, it's just been a constant learning curve, I think, and constantly saying yes to things that scare me.
Okay.
It's just, and then realizing I don't die, and that giving me a bit more confidence to say yes to the next thing.
Can you give me an example? Is there an example you have?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just so I do quite a lot of broadcast media. And I think especially, I moved to the UK in 2019, and I felt even more self-conscious about doing broadcast media. So I was like, sound Australian, I haven't been living here for that long, and I'm constantly banging on about how the UK government needs to do X, Y, and Z, and, what legitimacy do I have to do that? But I was really nervous when I started, my first interview on the BBC or on Channel 4 or, those are set up to be intimidating, really. You're fueled by incredibly experienced journalists, and I just had to. I think I did what a lot of women do initially, which is over-prepare. Just really actually underestimate how capable I was of dealing with it. And now I do media all the time. Like, I think about how much I used to prepare for those interviews, how long I would spend afterwards dissecting how I did and kind of ruminating. And now I do, just last week, we had a major development in a case that we have, a legal challenge we have against UK government over the Rosebank oil field. And I did, I think, 6 or 7 interviews in a day. And I did one 7 minutes after I got off the train in the train station.
Right.
I really am quite, and it's just, I think I know now that I can do it. And I also know that even when I think it's gone badly, I massively amplified in my own mind how badly it's gone. And other people don't tend to notice. And even if they do, they don't think twice about it after they've listened to it in the moment, just how much you overestimate what other people think and how long they're thinking about it.
Yeah, and how interested they are. It's we're the center of our universe, but we're not. Most other people are more interested in themselves than worrying about whether you did something good. I mean, that is brilliant. And I'm about to record a podcast where I'm talking about the voice in your head. And I talk about something called the chimp paradox a lot, which is this, this emotional bit of your brain that worries a lot about risk. And I often think that our chimps that are there to protect us from risk and alert us to risk, they think there's the black hole. They think they're going to die. But if you really spend a bit of time analyzing, how bad could it possibly be? And then how likely is that to happen? You're right. You're not going to die. And then obviously you've shown the more you do it, the more practice you have, the easier it and less scary it becomes. So yeah, I think that's an amazing example. And do you get, I presume, because again, this is quite a controversial area, do you get negative reactions sometimes? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I do quite a bit of, sort of talk radio, talk TV, and also I'm on social media, which is a cesspool of negative comment for women in particular.
Okay.
So I just don't take any of it personally, I guess. And that's not to say I think on social media I'm not in any way diminishing how damaging and how wrong it is that women are targeted the way that they are. But I think when I have combative interviews, because as you say, the topics that I work on are controversial, or there are certainly, I don't think they're controversial, but there are very powerful interests defending the status quo. And I'm good at, I think, depersonalizing it. So if someone's attacking me, I know they're attacking my argument. Okay. So that's helpful. And I also know that I'm right.
Okay, well, that is really interesting. That's a really interesting comment. And because you've got this passion and purpose, because I think also when anyone's criticized or feels like they're being criticized, often they really have a wobble because of their self-esteem isn't as solid as it could be. But it's interesting because this specific area that you're working in, that you can say, I know I'm right. That is amazing as a shield to that sort of thing that can really throw you off. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that's right.
Yeah. So if we could all feel like, and actually, again, one of the phrases I love, which comes from someone called Marissa Peer, but a lot of people use it nowadays, this concept of I am enough, I'm good enough, I'm fine. And therefore, whatever happens around me with things going wrong or people criticizing me, actually, I'm fine. You've got that in spades with this specific issue because you're like, I'm right and we have to do this. So it's a really interesting sort of mirror of a lot of what I work on around self-esteem. And you find people bring up the fact you're a woman, that comes up, does it, in terms of the negative stuff that you get?
I mean, on social media, it's just in the nature of the insults. It's just the language. It's gendered language. It's not so much that I'm a woman that's singled out as part of the advocacy. It's just
such a shame, isn't it? We think we've come.
And I think it also emboldens.
Yeah. I mean, go on, carry on. You carry on.
No, I was just going to say, I think the other thing that I've realised, having now done lots of broadcast media, but also when I'm in, I've given evidence to parliamentary committees and done other things that, as I said, in the past, I thought I would die if I did. Mm-hmm. I sounded so intimidating. Having done those and also watched a lot of other people do those things, I also know that most people who are on the media are very average. Do you know what I mean? Like they're not it's not that the world is just full of these really exceptional people and they're the ones who end up dominating our public lives. Like actually lots of politicians are pretty mediocre and lots of people who get interviewed on the press and lots of journalists, aren't that impressive. And I think that's the other thing. I just think if they can do it, I can do it, really. And I often, I think when I started doing lots of media, I would have a lot of trouble listening back to myself. And I would get my husband to listen back with headphones on and I would just watch his facial expressions. I understand how well I did, but invariably, and often I am on a panel in these interviews with someone from the oil and gas industry, for example. And, what my husband would always say to me is how much better I was than the other person. And that's partly because I was really well prepared, but partly because, we just overestimate, I think, always how good you have to be to deserve to be in a public space or speaking or exercising your voice,
Yeah. Okay. So great message for everyone out there. Just go for it, try it out and don't over prepare. Again, I've worked with quite a lot of people who over prepare and I'm like, let's have a go. Let's do a practice of going into a meeting without preparation and just see, you're not going to get fired for that one. Just see what it feels like. And so, it's quite amazing when they try it out. Just have a go and see what it feels like. And then people are like, oh, actually, it was actually pretty good. So yeah, it's an amazing message to send out there. In terms of, because it's so regularly in the news in terms of climate protests from Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion. What are your, and it is a controversial topic that comes up when roads are disrupted. And what are your thoughts around that when you're asked about it? Is it the right thing to be doing? Yeah. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think I have sort of two thoughts. The first is that I really understand the desperation that is at the root of those actions. I understand, having spent the last sort of 10 years day in, day out reading the climate science and reporting about the impacts of climate change. We are really it's hard to overstate how high the stakes are for us, I think, for all of us, and how far off track we are. Which isn't to say that it's not possible to get back on track, but we need to treat this like it's an emergency, which is why people call it the climate emergency. So I think if you really appreciate those stakes, it can seem completely baffling that this isn't the primary preoccupation of our governments and everyone in power. And I think that if you have tried to elect the right politicians, if you've written to your MPs, if you've done all of the other things that are the normal ways in a democracy that we try to persuade our governments to do the right thing, and none of those have worked, if you feel like none of those have worked, then I completely understand why you would turn to doing something disruptive, just out of that sense of desperation. But then I also think that from a sort of strategy perspective, it's also true that disruptive protest, unlawful protest, violent, civil disobedience, those have all been part of the way that social change has happened, both in this country but also globally. And we often sanitize, I think, in retrospect, how big social milestones, including suffrage for women, have been achieved. But, the suffragettes were very unpopular at the time, and they did things that were violent, and they destroyed property, and that was part of what made them as high profile and got the attention that they got. It's also part of how, the ANC in South Africa fought apartheid. We, I think, are very happy to just remember the parts of those movements that accord with what we think social movements should look like. But actually, that's not how they functioned in the past. And I think, that those tactics on their own aren't enough to create social change. But, as I said, the climate movement, what Uplift does is we use all sorts of different levers, including mobilising people on the streets and protest. And also we take the government to court, and we talk to journalists, and we talk to politicians, and we talk to the media. We're doing all of this, and we do a lot of policy analysis, and we have a lot of expertise, and we engage with the industry. We do all of those things, and that is what's needed to shift a problem that is as entrenched and that has as powerful a set of interests behind it as climate change does, I think.
Yeah. Okay. And for everyone who's listening, what's your call to arms? Like, what would you, if you want to say something to everyone out there in terms of what you want them to do, what would you say?
Yeah. So I think the UK is now at a crossroads with a new government in terms of our approach as a country to producing oil and gas. You know, as I said, we can't afford to extract it. You know, we can't afford to open up any new oil and gas fields if we are going to stay within safe climate limits. Mm-hmm. But also from a jobs perspective, from, you know, perspective of affordable energy in this country. You know, we've just lived through a few years of incredibly high household energy bills. That's been driven by our dependency on gas in particular. The UK has had the highest household energy bills in Western Europe because we use gas to heat our homes and to generate our electricity in large part. And we know what the alternative to that is, and it's renewable energy, which is cheaper, it's cleaner, it's better for our health, better for the climate. You know, there are so many reasons to move away from fossil fuels like oil and gas, including, you know, as I said, our affordability of energy as well as climate change. And I think the other thing is that we have an opportunity in the UK with amazing offshore wind resources in particular to be at the forefront globally of building an industry that employs tens of thousands of people that can ensure that we don't just lose jobs in the oil and gas industry. We can help those people transition into jobs that have a much longer term future. So it's a massive opportunity for this country to both do the right thing on climate, do the right thing nationally, and also show leadership globally. And so I would just say that anything people can do to encourage their friends, their networks, but certainly, you know, your MPs and the government to reinforce that the right thing to do is to move away from oil and gas and not double down on it is really crucial at this moment.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. And then just before I ask you about your 3 pieces of advice to your younger self, one of the things I want to start doing is asking women about their strengths, because I mean, you've already displayed it a lot during this podcast, this belief in yourself and your belief in what you can do. And so often when I ask women to talk through their strengths, they're quite slow to tell me them. And often I get 2 of them out before they start then going, but then I don't do this very well. So they'll tell me a strength and then they'll immediately negate it with something they don't do well. So I would love to hear from you. What are your greatest strengths, do you think?
Okay, I think one of my strengths is being able to see the big picture. Mm-hmm. I think in sort of setting up 2 organizations, that's really required me to be able to develop a strategy for a big problem. And I think that a lot of lawyers in particular are very detail oriented, and that is strength. You know, I really value that in my colleagues who are lawyers. But I think it's, you know, I often say that, you know, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Like it's good to be able to just take a step back, and that's something that I think I'm good at doing, and seeing where the real gaps are. Like if we really look at what our goal is, you know, what is it that's missing and what is it that we're doing well, and doing that kind of evaluation from a sort of 30,000 foot perspective is something that I enjoy doing, and I think I'm good at it.
Not I think, but I am good at.
I am good at it, sorry. Yes.
Anything else? Go and give me another one or another 2.
I think I am genuinely good at giving other people credit. Okay. I think you can do amazing things if you are comfortable with giving other people credit. And I don't just mean as a manager. I think, you know, both of the organizations I've run have deliberately operated with quite a low brand profile, if that makes sense. In both cases, and in general, I believe that you create social change through movements, not a single organization, not a single person, but, it's going to take a lot of us.
Mm-hmm.
And that really requires you being comfortable giving away the power. And I'm quite good at that, I think.
Yeah.
So
It's so fascinating. This is what happens every time. The qualifier. So that's one of the things I work with people on. Now, clearly, look, you're incredibly eloquent. You are passionate and have pursued what you're passionate about in terms of taking personal risk. There are many, many strengths that I could list now that I know people will see. So I'd encourage everyone out there, just think about what your strengths are, own them, and get rid of, I think, kind of fight. Yeah. And then lastly, can I just ask you, like, what would your 3 pieces of advice be to your younger self, sort of looking back? What would your piece of advice be that then everyone else can take away with them?
Yeah. So I think the one that we've discussed quite a bit already is just that I think people should take risks,
Mm-hmm.
and that they overestimate the scale of the consequence, the negative consequences of the risk they might be considering.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that I always tell people to take risks, because I just think, there's the sort of cognitive bias that where, and it's sort of about attachment to your status quo and that seeming like the most comfortable place to be, and people aren't very good at actually weighing up how massive the opportunities on the other side of the risk might be. Actually.
And the loss if you don't pursue them, as you said earlier. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
But also when you step into the unknown, you have no idea how many doors might open as a result of it. You don't even know what those doors are, let alone what lies on the other side of them.
Love that.
So I think that's really important. The second is that and this is something that my coach says to me, that I think is excellent advice, which is to run your own race, and to not compare yourself to other people. Mm-hmm. I think women struggle with a huge amount, partly because socially we're set up with all of these milestones and expectations around what we should be doing at a certain point in our lives and what success looks like. And I still struggle with that, but I think it's one piece of advice that I come back to again and again, which is not just, it's not just that you never have complete information about other people. The sort of information environments we're in are always very incomplete, like whether it's on Instagram or looking at someone's CV or whatever. Mm-hmm. But even leaving that aside, it's just so damaging, I think, to compare yourself to other people. And it distracts you from being clear on what's important to you as well. Mm-hmm. And then I think the third thing, which is related to that, is to be very clear about and to be led by your values.
Yeah.
And I think that is probably something that I would also list as a strength of mine, is that I have always been very clear on what my values are. Mm-hmm. And that's given me the courage to take risks, because I know that I'm trying to do the right thing. And I think when people feel really uncomfortable or unhappy, is often because they're acting in conflict with their values.
Yeah, absolutely. And often we don't spend enough time thinking about what they are and then how can we live by them. And it doesn't necessarily, you might be operating in a corporate environment, but there might be other ways that you can live out your values if your values are about helping other people. I think it's a great stabilizer and a great motivator to come back to what are your values and how can you live according to those values. Yeah, so amazing pieces of advice. So look, thank you so much, Tessa, for taking the time to talk to us today. Please do go and follow Tessa on social media. I will put links into the podcast so you can see what she's saying and all the advocacy and work that Uplift are doing. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today and a real inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks again.
Amazing.